Hello, welcome to Teaching Artistry with Courtney J. Boddie. That's me. This is a podcast that celebrates artists and advocates for community engagement. And this is We Can't Go Back, a video series in partnership with Creative Generation meant to examine, interrogate, and confront racist policies and systems in the arts. This series amplifies leaders in the arts and culture who drive radical change in communities through anti-racist and liberatory practices. Subscribe to the Teaching Artistry with Courtney J. Boddie YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I identify as a Black cisgendered woman, and I would like to uplift and pay respect to my ancestors across the African diaspora who have been stolen from their native lands and also within the US. I live in Brooklyn, and these are the unceded lands of the Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie nations. And I pay respect and uplift the indigenous diaspora woven into my history and DNA through a network of solidarity and love from the Cherokee, Creek, and Uchi nations. Now, let's welcome our guest, Peter J. Quo. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Courtney. Hi, I'm Peter J. Quo. I am the Associate Conservatory Director at American Conservatory Theater and a freelance artist, theater maker, EDI consultant. And I identify as a cis Asian American queer male, and I am streaming in from downtown Oakland on the unceded lands of the Ohlone peoples.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. You are quite an inspiration to me. And for several reasons, but over the summer, I took a series that you were a co-facilitator on, that Art Equity put together for BIPOC folks who are working in predominantly white institutions or PWIs. And there were several moments where I was like, yes, Peter, yes! Dropping truth bombs everywhere.
I'm so glad.
I absolutely adored it and appreciated it. So thank you again for accepting my invitation to be on this show. And
absolutely.
I'm curious, in your role in the arts, what are some ways that you embed anti-racism practices into your work?
At ACT, I kind of fulfill this multi-role in the fact that I do some administrative work for the organization, but I'm also contracted to do some directing work, specifically within the MFA acting program, and I also teach for them. And so I have kind of this multidisciplinary way that I function in my artistry, but teaching, actually directing things, and also doing through this administrative work. And the way it's interesting, the way I bring anti-racist practice is through my administration work and my directing work. That lens is constantly on, and I constantly have to pause myself when I'm doing certain things and be able to ask, okay, wait a minute. I want to make sure that we're looking at this through an equitable way, but also I want to make sure that the folks that I'm working with, predominantly those who kind of sit at different places of the hierarchy, know that I'm open to feedback, and I'm really opening to listening to hear if there's something that they're not being served or supported. Because I think that's part of these practices is it's all about how one holds kind of an invisible amount of power, right? And how just their presence in the room, or by title, or by the way that they carry themselves, one might be exerting a certain amount of influence and authority that doesn't really make sense in the moment, or it prevents from more conversation from happening. The biggest thing anyone can really lean into, and I do this with my students, I do this with the actors that I work with, I say, I don't know everything. The moment I walk into a room, whether it's a classroom or it's a directing room, I don't know everything, because you all have individual experiences and lives, and I don't know what they are. I can familiar myself with them as much as possible, and I can make sure that I'm accommodating for those different experiences, or making sure that there's room to be able to talk about them, because they may be affecting you, not just in the way that you create, but how you walk in the room. And I want to acknowledge that so that we can make space so that there can be that dialogue. And if I am not seeing something, I want you to tell me, because I think the biggest thing is when the internalization of kind of the way we deal with oppression, right? And that in this kind of power dynamic, especially as a director or a teacher or a middle management administrator, there's this feeling of, well, that person doesn't have time to deal with my issues, or they don't have the capacity, or it's not their responsibility, or if I bring it up, they will see me as weaker or lesser or whatever. I just want to disrupt that, like right from the top, because we're all humans and we all have these experiences we're going through. So to me, that's the biggest part of it. And then also just understanding how systemic oppression functions and how we're enacting it is a big part of it. I then educate folks to also recognize that themselves, so that I'm not the only person doing all that work in the room, but that others are able to say, okay, I want to also get better. And so please allow that feedback to be both ways.
You know, as you were talking, I was thinking about two things. One, I'm a adjunct professor, and for the first time, I'm teaching this fall. So there's a lot going on. But we had week 2, and I try to create sort of what I think I've called in the past, like more democratic. Like here's what we need to do today. How do you want to do it? Or here I'm sort of moving us along, but I'm really sort of saying, well, how, this is the thing, what should we do? What would you like to do? But the thing that I'm recognizing is how are they giving me feedback? So how are we making that reciprocal?
Yeah.
Is something that I would like to be more mindful of. And then more in my organization, we had, and they were very ad hoc initially, starting in June. There's so many changes, and the Black Lives Matter protest and movement was very heightened, as totally as it should be. But there was, and yet we were also having staffing changes coming down the pike, and it was very challenging to, everything was challenging, period.
Right.
But I thought it would be wise for us to create space for just talking. So we created open hours where anybody in our department can come in this particular time and just talk, and they can ask questions about, whatever's going on in the world, something that's going on personally in their lives. So it didn't have to be work related. Just creating some space that you just mentioned has been really powerful. So we took a second because the summer was insane. Like July and August were just very, very challenging. So they kept getting like ad hoc, but now we have one that's scheduled weekly. And that's been so far really lovely to hear, because there's some things that I feel like our staff, they're so good, they're so great at what they do, and they contribute so much, but because so much can be about the work and not about the person, but that you can't actually separate those two in certain ways, right? Anyway, so I appreciate hearing that, because that can give me some thoughts about how to continue to create that space.
As you were talking, and we were talking a little bit earlier, there's this question mark of like, how do we break these systems of oppression in education? And one of the things, like while you were talking, I realized, there's no class on emotional intelligence, really. All we teach is this is how you get the answer. Everything is product driven. Everything is how do we create. It's our education system in our country right now is really driven on a capitalistic structure. What are the skills that you get? What is the knowledge you get? What are all these things that you get to become a quote, quote, productive human being? And that's all it's focused on. And how do you get into the workforce and things like that? And not that I'm saying like we shouldn't be productive parts of our society, but actually having an emotional intelligence and a better understanding of ourselves and how we function in the world and how the way we respond to each other in the world will actually make us even more productive. And it will make the process even better and more humane. And it's oddly our education system is structured in the kind of the power stay the most powerful, and they get to be the most relaxed in living their life. So it's kind of crazy, and sometimes.
Well, let's talk about that. I think it's funny that you said earlier off camera that you're not exactly in education, but you do teach. But let's talk about artists. So I know that you just launched a new piece, right? And I felt like I looked in your Facebook feed. It looked like it was really exciting. So I'm just curious about how are you working with artists? How can artists feel emboldened to really forge the future of this thing called arts or education, but arts from a fiercely anti-racist perspective?
The training program at ACT is an MFA in acting. So I primarily deal with actors in that training. And it's one of those things where actors have somewhat become some of the most disempowered individuals in our industry at times. It's depending, and so much of it relies on the director or the producer or what space they create. So something that I do with the actors and the students that I train specifically, I look at it first as a whole. What spaces do you want to be working in? What kind of artistry do you want to be making? And making sure that you're aligned with those. If you're noticing that a director or a producer or individual has issues with the way you function, or you just being a human being and treating you with respect, like, do you want to be in those spaces? And also recognizing that our system is not okay right now. Both our society as a whole, but our industry is very problematic. And how do you also gain the skills to recognize what is the best way for you to work? But also, if you're in that situation, what are you willing to compromise to survive in that situation so that you can get to the next step where you have more control and authority to actually dismantle some of those racist practices? So to me, part of that teaching of awareness is about figuring out, okay, in this situation, I have very little authority or power. And how do I recognize that? And how do I do what I can to navigate it to get to another spot when I can have a little bit more power and then disseminate that? Or decide this is not for me and walk away from that situation. The biggest power I think artists have is the ability to say no, but we're terrified to use it because we're constantly told, say yes, say yes, say yes. The improv rule is yes, and the if you want to get a job, take everything that you can rule. And that already strips us away from power in that moment. And those power structures specifically disempower Black and brown individuals the most, because in the end, those who are more in power and white individuals or light-skinned individuals feel like they can lean further into those who are oppressed. And the colorism of that is very much like, well, you have less opportunities, so you can't say no to this. They take advantage of that situation, of the awareness of systemic oppression, and they actually know that your opportunities are diminished. So you actually have less power.
So let's talk a little bit more about the institution, right? Like,
yeah.
How that example that you just gave is like the definition of white supremacy.
Right.
Power hoarding, asserting that power and oppressing others. So, how do we shift that? How do we change that? How do we dismantle that?
I think once you get into it, part of it is, okay, assessing if a place is willing to be open to that change. And I think that's why, like, the selection of whatever institution or working place you're in, either you go in and if it's working against you entirely, you're just going to exhaust yourself, get burned out, and like, it's going to cost your health so much. And for some individuals, it's not worth it. Or for some individuals, it's kind of like, that if you have a lot of privilege, utilize it in that way and be at those locations and push for change. But if you're at a place that's going to fully resist, so I think first is just assessing, is this place actually able to make change? If not, then there's having to find another place that can, so that hopefully that place will rise and eventually eliminate that other location, which is unwilling to change its practices. Because I think one of the false ideas is that every place can change, or every place will be able to go through this reckoning. And I don't think that that is actually true. There's the kind of three methods that I think most people hang on to, which is burn it down, or build our own thing, or go into the system that exists, kind of dismantle it from the inside and rebuild as you're dismantling. I tend to live personally in that third boat, whereas I know people who are like, burn it all down. I'm like, yep, I agree, go for it, especially if a place is resistant to change, or build it on your own. Now, to me, I love people who are in the build it on your own camp because they're starting fresh, but the resources are very limited because that power hoarding has already occurred, right? So all those resources are already siphoned away. I think all three of those prongs are what we need to do to be able to really dismantle and disrupt institutionalized white supremacy, racism, and oppression. And so I think I can speak more on the expertise of being in an institution that has the willingness and conversation to change, but is having a hard time doing it, because that's where I tend to work in. And I would say part of it is just leading by example, being able to, for me, and I want to recognize as a cis Asian American, specifically Chinese American, as an East Asian, I have a little bit more privilege than other Asians who, it's purely colorism, the model minority myth, all these things. And so I try to leverage that privilege as much as I can in those situations to recognize there's a whole demographic of individuals who aren't even in this space. And so I lead by example as much as I can that way. And part of that is finding those co-conspirators in positions of power to be able to gain their trust and be able to have them utilize their privilege to be able to change the system. So in certain ways, I guess in a certain way, I look at it as who has power and try and help them understand the change. I don't know if the tactic of just remove them is always going to work unless they are unwilling to listen, or just talking at them. I think it needs to be a little bit more holistic.
Yeah, I mean, many places that we could go, right? There's cancel culture, but like Toya, who's a guest, Toya Lillard talks about how the abolitionist way is you can't like we have to help even if somebody feels like it seems as though they're unwilling to change. Cancel culture is still a part of a white supremacist culture.
Yes.
And so, no, we can't, like, shaming is not actually the best choice if we want change to happen.
Right.
It's hard because people are angry, and there's often productive rage, and then there's just, rage that is actually just not going to get us anywhere, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that's really interesting what you're talking about is, like, look to the folks that you perceive to have some power, and are they willing to change and use that power? And then those of us who have power, how are we utilizing that power? How are we taking risks? And sometimes it is a risk.
Absolutely.
Step out and say, no, this is not right. No, we need to change. I mean, before we started talking, I was saying, like, I'm using my voice as much as I can. And I'm saying things. Sometimes I say things that I'm like, why did you just do that?
Yeah, sure.
But then, and then I see some sort of shift, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually curious about urgency.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about this for a second? So urgency.
Yeah.
I see two things about urgency. One is change has to happen. It has to happen, and urgent, responding, listening, acting needs to happen in order to affect change. then there's the urgency that is like a construct of white supremacy, in terms of everything is a priority and everything has to be done now and da da da. So I continue to have a struggle. I don't feel it as much now, but I was feeling this definitely like in August about, the urgency of response, public response, after the first wave of responses that felt performative from predominantly white institutions. I'm talking about really. And if those institutions are actually doing the work, how urgent is it to be talking about it externally? Or is the perception that if you're not talking about it externally, you must not be doing it internally? Do you see what I'm saying?
For me, it's interesting because so what you just articulated is, I think, what I've constantly been thinking about similarly, because urgency has also been a thought on my mind. And there's a difference to me with urgency to acknowledge and urgency to work versus urgency to solve, like to have fixed the problem. You had such a visual response there. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well, because I think it's this kind of, I agree. So similar to what you were just saying about cancel culture too, this kind of feeling that I've run into with some folks where it's like, oh, that feels so performative, or that's performative and that's performative. I'm like, okay. And for me, like, even the idea of utilizing pronouns, I really incorporated that over the past few years. And for some folks, I've talked with, like, well, that feels performative. I'm like, okay, but does it hurt you? Does this performativeness hurt you right now? If it doesn't, then the person that it actually might help, I don't care if you consider it performative or not. If I'm in 10 people and to me the genders are obvious, I'm still going to do it right now because I actually just don't know. And if it looks like I'm performing, in a certain way I am. I'm performing that I'm saying if someone else wants to identify with a gender that is not cis, I am someone who will understand that. And that is the performance that I want to be able to put out there right away. And if someone wants to judge me for that, as long as it is more helpful to someone else, I don't mind right now. And it may still be, oh, I still have things to learn about trans issues. And I do. I know I do. But I'm not going to not do some of that work while I'm still figuring that out, because if I can perform this ability to have that conversation, I might learn more from someone else as well, too. So when we see white American theater went out, all these statements without, and some people are like, well, they're so performative. I'm like, some of them might be, but let's hold them accountable. Now that they've put this out there, in 6 months, a year from now, we can say, well, this is what you put out there. Were you just performing that, or are you actually doing the work? But I think having no statement because you want to fix everything first, that isn't building a relationship with a community. It is not. I'm afraid to go. It's one of those things someone kept saying, or I was having a conversation with someone and they're like, well, I don't know why Broadway has been exclusive to you. Like, in my mind, I said something about this. And I said, well, I don't feel welcome in your space because your space hasn't welcomed me historically. So I need you to put the sign out there for me to feel comfortable to even walk in.
What I just heard you say is what are the ways institutions are building community? Part of it is you have to have the conversation. You have to put the statements are a part of the conversation or the dialogue.
Right. And what's interesting is when you get called out on the statement, that's a dialogue. And that's an invitation to be like, oh, we put this out there, you criticize it, but you're talking with us. Great. Now it's kind of like now that I have your attention, I guess, can we talk further?
Oh, see, thanks for flipping that on me.
I also think some institutions will then get defensive though too. They're like, oh, we got called out, let's shut everything down. It's like, we got called out. Okay, great. Are you willing to talk further about this? Because we put this out because we want to improve. You're telling us we're not. Can we listen to you further? And honestly, if we're going to do that, let's compensate you for your time. Let me get back to that, right?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That puts things in a a way that I understand in terms of moving journeys. Like
Yeah.
these conversations for me are part of my journey,
Yeah.
and potentially for anybody else who's watching this, right?
Yeah.
Um, and using that call out as a quote unquote in my education lingo, like a teachable
Absolutely.
moment. Oh, now let's have that conversation. And in fact, yeah, I'm understanding something now. Something's just clicking for me. Where our institution put out a statement and it wasn't great, and they were called out by the staff. And about a week or so later, and there was dialogue, and a week or so later, a new statement came out and acknowledged the mistake of the original statement.
And that
And
sounds great.
it was great. And now I think, and then there were further conversations, and I've seen a lot of action and a lot, we have to keep going, but I'm seeing evidence of the dialogues that have happened now in action.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about just time, like I was tying, how quickly do those things need to happen? The statements, the second statement, a response statement. How quickly do those things actually have to happen? A month ago, 2 months ago, even, I was like, we're not moving fast enough, and I don't understand. And now, now about 3 months out, I'm like, oh, I can see we've actually done a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Still, again, so much to do, but
Right.
I have seen real, which feels like perspective. Like you need a little perspective, right?
Yeah.
Let's dream a little bit, shall we?
Sure.
Let's think about what does a racially just, fully liberated world look like?
One other person has asked me about this recently, and I think I'm a very positive person, but I also feel like my response to this comes out very cynical. And in the sense that because we're even aware of the racial injustice in our world, a truly just society is not something that I believe will ever appear in our lifetime, in the sense that we will always carry the history with us, and that history both creates unconscious bias, all these different issues that allow people to mistreat others. And no matter how much work that we put into it, that can diminish, but it's not going to go away because we carry that knowledge and history with us. Now, I think there's a difference between when history is taught versus when history is lived. I think learning about the Holocaust, learning about those oppressions and like slavery and all the other things that have happened in this country, we won't repeat those cycles if we're not still enacting them. But because they're still being enacted, it's hard to like wash some of that away. I think racial injustice is so built in the DNA of our society right now. It's almost impossible to extract out. That being said, we can constantly diminish it. Like I think in that same video of COVID-19, this COVID-19 is white supremacy essentially, or white supremacy is virus and it's COVID-19, is we can do everything we can to manage the spread of it, but it's still going to kind of exist in the world. But how do we reduce the harm as much as possible? So in that sense, I think my hope and achievement is for something that I will never see in my lifetime. But I know if I don't put the work into it now, it's going to drastically affect those down the line. And to me, sometimes this conversation comes straight to that. It's really how quote selfish an individual is. This undoing justice or environmentalism, my gosh, isn't about, it's not going to directly affect you right now, but it's going to be another lifetime. Like how much truly is it just about you? Yeah. Cynical, but like.
No, but I mean, I like talking to you a lot. Like, you say
Thanks, Courtney.
that, like, oh wow. But yeah, I don't know if it's possible to see a racially just world now or in our lifetime. But the idea of looking to 7 generations in the future, it's an Indigenous or First Nations focus around like what you do now should be in service of 7 generations down the line.
Mhm.
And if you're not doing that, then you're not thinking or acting big enough. And so what you just said about, it's not about what I'm going to get to experience. That begets me putting the work in to
Mhm.
reach for a racially just, liberated world.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, is a really important thing to note. But I also like this question because I want to know what I'm working towards.
Right.
And I'm curious about what other people think we're working towards. And so that build, like holding the history, making sure that we're working towards not repeating those things, even if they are happening around us. How do we support changing those things that are happening around us?
Yeah.
And so, Peter, I really appreciate your view on this work. I can't wait to find ways to be able to be in space and community with you again.
I'd love that.
Yeah, thank you so much for just being great.
Thank you, Courtney. I'm so glad you're doing this series, and I hope more people listen to it. And I can't wait to go back and listen to a couple of episodes myself. I haven't heard the whole thing, so I'm super excited.
And thank you all for watching. And remember that this episode, along with other content, will be on the audio platform. So subscribe to SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And something that Peter said was about creating spaces for like our humanity. So with that, I say we can't go back. We won't go back. We can't go back again. And let's go onwards, moving forward. All right, thanks everybody.
Now is my time to shine. When your time comes, don't postpone it. When others doubt and out, you don't condone it. Truth be told, yourself is your toughest opponent. When your moment comes, grab hold and own it. Never let go, stand tall and hold tight. Overcoming obstacles is the objective in life. Doubters all the night, and unto them you shine bright. Cause inside your head, on goes the light. Ignite.